Mr. President, I come today to talk about the nomination of Judge Gorsuch to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Once again, throughout the hearings last week, Judge Gorsuch proved that he has the knowledge, he has the temperament, he has the experience to serve on our nation's highest court. He laid out a clear judicial philosophy that adheres to what I think most Americans want to see happen today on the court, and what clearly the framers of the Constitution thought would happen. In his own words, Judge Gorsuch said, "I have one client, and it's the law." That's the way the founders saw the Supreme Court. They didn't see it as a legislative body. All good judges had to do was read the law. They didn't have to be happy with the law. They didn't have to approve the law. They didn't have to determine that the law and the Constitution met their exact standard. They just had to determine what the law and the Constitution said. In fact, Mr. President, the first Supreme Court had 6 judges. No thought that it was a legislative body that had to have a tie-breaking judge so you could legislate. They just thought 6 judges are plenty, and by the way, they thought they needed 6 circuits, and each of those judges wrote a circuit. So even when there was an appeal to the Supreme Court, one of the judges had already heard the case at the lower level. That judge heard the case again. Listened to see if that judge heard anything new. Something might change their mind. The other 5 of them were sitting there with the appeal of one of their colleagues, and nobody saw that as a problem because the court wasn't about legislating. The court was about determining what the law should say. Again, Judge Gorsuch, I have one client. It's the law. It's not the little guy. It's not the big guy. It's not the medium-sized guy. It is the law. He was asked over and over again, are you going to find for the little guy or the big guy? Well, it's not the judge's job. The judge's job is to read the law so that both the little guy and the big guy know when they're in court that this is a country where the rule of law matters. They know when they enter into a contract that if you and your lawyer have read the law right, there shouldn't at the end of the day be very much gray space about what that contract said. Throughout his career, Judge Gorsuch has demonstrated his commitment to interpreting the Constitution as it's written, applying the rule of law, and not legislating from the bench. Judges are not politicians in robes. I think that may be another Gorsuch comment. Judges are not politicians in robes. If he didn't say it, his career as a judge shows that he believes it. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues have shown that their deference to the Constitution is not the same when it comes to the Senate's role to advise and consent. I'm particularly dismayed by the Democratic leader's intention to filibuster Judge Gorsuch's nomination. Republicans have never filibustered a Democratic nominee. Yet colleagues across the aisle appear willing to do just that. Such a maneuver would only be an affront to our national norms. I don't know in the history of the country, I think there's one filibuster led by Democrats against a nomination by a Democrat president when Lyndon Johnson nominated Abe Fortas to move from associate judge to the chief judge's role. Didn't happen in 1968 because, one, it was a presidential year and judges don't get confirmed to the Supreme Court in a presidential year in vacancies that hadn't even occurred yet. And 2, it was led by Democrats in a Senate that had an overwhelming Democratic majority. There has never been a partisan filibuster effort involving any judge on the Supreme Court until right now. And I'm disappointed that that's what the leader of Democrats in the Senate says he wants to do. According to Robert Davidson, the chances of success, he's a Brooklyn College history professor, he said the chances of success of a partisan filibuster are 0. So why pursue it, would be my thought. Kim Strassel recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, never in U.S. history have we had a successful partisan filibuster of the Supreme Court nominee. In the last century, only 3 Supreme Court justices have faced a filibuster. The most recent, Justice Alito, was ultimately confirmed when 19 Democrats refused to back the filibuster of his nomination. He had the full vote, and he got a majority vote. One would think that if Senate Democrats were willing to upend Senate tradition to block this nomination, they'd have an unassailable reason to block it. They'd be saying, this judge is not qualified. This judge hasn't served his time. We don't know what he'd do as a judge. He's been on the circuit, the appeals court for appeals judges, one of those circuit judge jobs for a decade. And when you look at case after case, when you look at appeal after appeal, you see an unbelievably fine record as a judge. In announcing his intention to mount this filibuster, the leader of Democrats in the Senate said Judge Gorsuch's, quote, was unable to sufficiently convince me that he'd be an independent check, end quote, on the executive branch. You know, the American Bar Association unanimously gave Judge Gorsuch's nomination their highest rating. They disagree. As they explain, based on, this is their quote, based on writings, interviews, and analysis, we scrutinized to each of our ratings. We discerned that Judge Gorsuch believes strongly in the independence of the judicial branch of government, and we predict that he will be a strong but respectful voice in protecting it. End the quote from the American Bar Association, which many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said over and over again, this is the ultimate test of qualification for the court. When I met with the judge last month, he left no doubt in my mind that he would uphold the judiciary's unique constitutional role in our system of checks and balances. Let me go back to that other quote here for a minute. What was it that the senator from New York said? Judge Gorsuch was unable to sufficiently convince me that he'd be an independent check on the executive branch. I'm not even sure I know in the Constitution where that's the job of the judge. The job of the judge is to read the law and look at the Constitution. The job of the Congress is to pass the law. The job of the president is to sign the law. And unless there's some constitutional problem with that law, it's not the judge's job to decide whether the law is right or not, unless there is a constitutional reason to do that. Last week, I mentioned Judge Gorsuch's qualifications for the bench, but I think they bear repeating as we enter the next few days. As a graduate of Columbia University, a graduate of Harvard Law, and Oxford University, his academic credentials are at the highest level. Judge Gorsuch has served his country admirably as a Supreme Court clerked for a Democrat on the court, Byron White, who had been appointed by President Kennedy, and a Republican appointee, Anthony Kennedy, appointed by President Reagan. He's been the principal deputy associate attorney general of the United States at the Department of Justice. And in 2006, George W. Bush nominated him to serve on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The Senate confirmed his position at that time unanimously. Every single Democrat, 12 of them now serving in the Senate, who were in office, supported his nomination in 2006. In the decade that he served on the court, he's showed independence, he's shown integrity, he showed a mainstream judicial philosophy, and he showed a legal capacity that makes him a worthy successor to Justice Scalia on the court. There is no precedent for requiring a 60-vote threshold to confirm a Supreme Court justice, and Judge Gorsuch has given this body no reason to demand one now. I certainly look forward to supporting his nomination. It will reach the Senate floor, I believe, after the Judiciary Committee deals with it early next week. I hope by the time we leave here a week from Friday that Judge Gorsuch is on his way to join the Supreme Court as an associate justice. And by the way, if he does that, he'll be the first associate justice to ever serve on the court with a judge that he, 2 decades or more ago, clerked for when he and Judge Kennedy get a chance to serve together.